All right, everybody, let's get started. So, we've looked at a lot of different things related to race and ethnicity so far. We've talked about the idea of race being a human construct versus ethnicity being rooted in things like culture. We've looked at how race was kind of formed in the United States over the years, or in North America, I should say, and has kind of become inexorably linked with slavery. We've talked about ways that race has been manipulated. You guys saw the documentary 13th. Um, and then in the last lecture, we started to get into some of the main kind of ideas about what race and ethnicity are. So today we're going to continue with that. And we're going to look at something that I think is probably pretty familiar to you. Pretty much everybody has heard this at one point or another in their lives, and that is the debate about a melting pot or a salad bowl. And we've all heard the United States called a melting pot at various points, right? Um, but maybe depends on maybe who taught you. You might have also heard the idea that the U.S. is a salad bowl, and both of these are metaphors to kind of describe the way that basically all the various racial and ethnic groups in the United States coexist and mix with one another. And you know that the melting pot has always been held up as what the U.S. is, right? It's a nation of immigrants, and everybody kind of comes together and combines all of their various ideas and beliefs, and it creates one new distinct culture. And as time has gone on, and we've gotten more and more, kind of closer to the present day, this is something that has been called into question about whether or not it's accurate. So that's what we're going to start exploring. So to start, what we'll do is we'll look at really what melting pot and salad bowl mean in a sociological sense. And really what we're talking about when we say melting pot is assimilation. When we talk about the salad bowl, we're talking about what's called ethnic pluralism, which might be a slightly less common phrase. So let's talk about what these mean. So when we say assimilation, in the purest sense, it means the complete kind of combination of all of the various cultural, racial, ethnic, biological, physiological, psychological components of various groups in society to make one new group. When I was in high school, I think, Time Magazine, who we've seen some covers before, they did this kind of interesting piece where they basically took a composite and, like, proportionally speaking, based on all of the various people in the United States, they created a composite of what an American would look like if we were truly fully assimilated, where everybody intermarried with each other and had children, and then all of their children intermarried, and so on and so forth. And it's something that would take many generations. And what it was kind of doing, though, was looking at basically kind of a commentary on the idea that we are not a true melting pot, because what that would mean is that we'd really have one united culture now, basically, because everybody would be fully assimilated in and share all of the same kind of things. So what we see now is really more of a discussion about how the United States is a salad bowl or an ethnically plural society. And what that means is that you have lots of different groups who might overlap in some ways. There have to be things that connect us, like language we've talked about before is one of the best ways that this happens. But that basically we all coexist. And while these groups might overlap and partially assimilate, we never really fully combine to create one new, unique culture. It's really kind of an amalgam of different little cultures all kind of living together. And there's nothing wrong with that either. The issue that comes up with ethnic pluralism is whether or not it is seen as being fair to all groups. And that's where this idea of accommodation versus an inequalitarian society come into play. So in an accommodationist version of ethnic pluralism, everybody exists together. Everybody is treated equally in the eyes of the law. It implies that there will be social equality as well, which we know is very important. In some ways, it's just as, if not more important than legal equality. There's equal access to jobs. Basically, you and I might be different ethnically or racially or culturally, but we are treated the same way by the society that we both live in. And if that exists, then an ethnically plural society is fine. The problem that comes up is that in a lot of places in the world, and the US has elements of this too, we see what are called inequalitarian, where basically one or more groups does not necessarily have equal access to all of the services and legal protections of a society. Um, and it doesn't have to be overt. It's not necessarily always something that's legal. It could be social inequality. It could be economic inequality. And I think you would be hard pressed to find a credible sociologist or social scientist who would say that the United States does not have at least some elements of this. So that's where a lot of the work in the US is today when we talk about social reform, is trying to eliminate some of these issues where, yeah, technically speaking, everybody is legal in the eyes of the law. We don't have laws that are explicitly discriminatory about, race and ethnicity. But that doesn't mean that in society we don't have inequality based on race and ethnicity. And that's kind of what we have to address. And what that leads us also to is the final one, segregation. Segregation, we know what that means in an American context with the Jim Crow South and how it's directed or has been directed in the past against African Americans. But segregation is something that has existed in many societies. And this is really the kind of worst form of ethnic pluralism. All right, it's a society where everybody coexists, but in segregation, they very deliberately attempt to separate you. So it's almost like a society within a society, right? So in the U.S., it was like the lunch counters, restaurants, all these various places where Black and white Americans were not allowed to congregate together. In other parts of the world, for example, in South Africa, there was what was called apartheid, which was a very extreme form of segregation. And you had Black and white South Africans limited to different regions of the country, and that's not an equal society in any way. So that kind of becomes the danger if you have an inequalitarian, ethnically plural society, is that often they start to display elements of segregation in them. So as we move on to the symbolic interactionist perspective, most of this centers around what's called the contact hypothesis, which basically is a hypothesis that looks at how and why societies either become more or less equitable, especially if they are pluralist. All right. So in other words, what makes a society that's very diverse work well, and what makes a society that's very diverse not work well? All right. And obviously, we know that symbolic interactionism is a micro level perspective. So it's going to deal with daily interactions between people. And what the contact hypothesis says is basically any interactions that you have, and remember, these can be active or passive. You can be having a conversation with someone. It could just be how you perceive yourself to be treated. It could be observations. So everything that happens to you in a society, in order for it to work towards eliminating inequality, needs to have those four kind of goals. You need to feel like you are of an equal status with people from other ethnic and racial groups. You need to have shared societal goals. You need to all kind of want the society to move generally in the same direction. There needs to be clear cooperation where different groups work together to achieve certain goals. And you need to have what's called positive feedback, which in this sense basically means when people exit an interaction, they feel good about that interaction, that both sides feel like they were treated equally and the interaction was a positive one. And if you have all four of those things consistently in all the interactions in your society, you can work towards a accommodationist, ethnically plural society. That's kind of the goal. If you don't have those, they start to reinforce stigmas and stereotypes. And the less frequent those things, or less frequently those things exist in interactions, the more rapidly stigmas and stereotypes will be created, which then leads towards segregation or inequalitarian societies, right? Now, let's talk about some of the examples of this. When we talk about nature of interactions, like equal status, there are lots of ways that you can create unequal statuses, especially when we look at symbolic interactionism. Like language is a big part of this. So, for example, in the segregationist South, this is one of the most kind of like insidious versions of this that existed. So, in the segregationist South, the way that black and white Americans interacted was highly regimented, both in a formal and an informal way. So, an informal way of showing that there was not equal status. Um, in the segregationist South, if you were an adult black male and you greeted a adult white male, you would have to call him Mister or Sir, and that man, the white man, would often refer to the adult black man as a boy. All right. Um, and that's an example of like unequal status, right? It's a label. And you see that type of thing, like giving child labels to adults in societies that have unequal statuses. Um, so that's like an example of like something that would reinforce stigmas and stereotypes. And there's lots of others, but I wanted to give you like a real world one from the United States that has existed. Now, as we move to the conflict theory, um, the conflict theory always says that there's a group of haves and a group of have-nots. And the conflict theory, as I'm sure you guessed, basically says that race exists as a way to oppress, and that it has been done in several ways. I'm going to kind of bounce around here. So we'll start actually at the bottom. Internal colonialism has to do with, like, for example, like reservation systems with like Native Americans. All right. We know that Native Americans have very consistently been separated from like the main kind of American society over the years. If we go to caste, we've talked about what caste and class are. The conflict theory says that race has been applied to those. So in a caste system, slavery is a good example of this. Race-based slavery is a caste system. You also see that in a lot of societies that have had legal versions of racial discrimination, like segregation, things like anti-miscegenation laws are passed, which basically means that people from different races are not allowed to have children together. In class systems, you'll see like economics try to replace race, or at least in a overt way. Probably the most famous in the United States would be when we look at inner cities. We all have heard the phrase "the ghetto," right? And we know that when you say the word "ghetto" in like kind of colloquial, in just kind of common speech in the United States, that creates a very specific picture for most people. That means the inner city. It typically means an inner city with a large minority population, with a lot of crime. And a place that people see as undesirable to live. And you can see why all those things loop together that can then create, these perceptions of like racial inequality. So like in the conflict theory, they would say that like class is a way that you perpetuate racial inequality. And then there's also sports, and we'll talk about that in a second. This is one that is a little bit newer in terms of its study and kind of the research that's been done. All right. So if we take a look at this chart here, what this is a breakdown of all of the athletes in 5 of the major professional sports leagues in the United States. You have baseball, MLB, soccer, MLS, basketball, right, the NBA, football, the NFL, and then the WNBA, the Women's Professional Basketball League, right? And as we can see, there is a pretty wide array of like breakdowns of like the racial and ethnic makeup of the league's players, right? The NBA, the NFL, and the WNBA are predominantly leagues that are made up of African American athletes first, and then white athletes second, with very small proportions of Asian, Latino, or some of the other ethnic kind of designations and racial designations. And then when you look at baseball and MLS, they're actually a lot more diverse. And while you see that in both, there are, at least a plurality, a majority white athletes in baseball and a plurality white athletes in soccer. You also have to take in mind the demographics of the country. And actually, if you look at Major League Soccer, that is pretty close to, it's not exact, but it's close. It's the closest of all the sports leagues to the actual proportions of different ethnic and racial groups in the United States. So I know we tend to pay more attention to football or basketball or baseball, But soccer actually kind of has the distinction of being, the maybe the most reflective sport of the makeup of the country. Now, this is just the athletes, though, and this is where the conflict theory comes into play, and it's kind of interesting. The point that gets made or is brought up a lot is look at the breakdown of like ownership, executives, coaches, a lot of the power positions, if you will. So if we take a look, you have in the NFL a pretty noticeable skew. While the majority of players are African American, as soon as you get to the league or coaches or the CEOs, the executives who own the teams, there's a very very heavy skew of white ownership and white people in leadership positions. And so this is one of the things that gets brought up as showing some form of discrimination in football, is that yeah, you have a majority of players who are African American, and players are paid very well, but in the positions of ownership and power, you don't see that type of diversity. The NFL has actually taken some steps to stop this, or to combat this. In particular, the NFL has created what's called the Rooney Rule, which says that teams must interview minority candidates for coaching and executive positions. Now, in basketball, basketball kind of prides itself as being one of the most progressive professional sports. And you see, at least for coaching, it is. You have almost a 50-50 split. It's not there yet, between white and African American coaches. But the same issue: league offices, owners. Now, basketball has taken steps here too. A couple of years ago, the owner of I believe it was the LA Clippers, was caught on an audio recording saying some highly racist things about a basketball player named Magic Johnson. He's one of the best basketball players in history, if you haven't heard of him. He's a black player, or a retired black player. And it was very, very clear that this guy was, saying some very racist, derogatory things, and the league forced him to sell the team. So it's not to say that there aren't efforts to combat some of these issues, but sports has kind of come into the forefront because there are a lot of things within sports, even though we tend to hold them up as being one of these kind of like great equalizers for people, where you still see a lot of these challenges. And that's something we'll get into in our next talk. We'll kind of keep expanding on this. All right, so that's a good place to stop for the day. Hopefully we got something out of that. And yeah, I will talk to you soon.